Aisha Carter had been fighting for her community for as long as she could remember. Known as a fierce advocate for civil rights, she had earned a reputation for standing up to those who abused their power, especially when it came to issues of racial injustice. That evening, as she walked home through a desolate industrial area on the outskirts of town, Aisha had no idea she was being watched. The streets were quiet, the tall, vacant warehouses casting long shadows across the broken pavement. A light drizzle had begun, the wet ground glistening under the faint glow of scattered streetlights. There was an eerie calm in the air, a silence that made her feel exposed, but Aisha, in her years of activism, had learned to face such moments with a steady resolve. She gripped her coat tighter around her as she continued her walk, unaware of the sinister intentions forming in the minds of those who followed her. Harris and Blake, two officers with a long record of aggressive behavior, had been patrolling this area for years. Known among their colleagues for their hardened attitudes and deep-seated biases, they operated under the radar, their misconduct often ignored or even supported by higher-ups who shared their views. For them, tonight was just another chance to unleash their suppressed anger, to find someone they could assert dominance over without fear of consequences. From the darkness of their patrol car, they watched Aisha walk alone, her back straight, her stride confident. And to them, that confidence was an affront. In their minds, she was out of place, and that was reason enough to remind her of her place in the hierarchy of their twisted worldview. Blake's fingers drummed impatiently on the steering wheel as he exchanged a look with Harris. "You see her? The way she walks around here like she owns the place," he muttered, a sneer forming at the corner of his mouth. Harris, with a faint, cruel smile, responded, "Yeah, I see her. Been seeing her too much, if you ask me. Someone needs to teach her a lesson. Make sure she knows she doesn't belong here." His tone was sharp, tinged with disdain. In his mind, Aisha represented everything he despised: strength, dignity, resilience. He wanted to tear that down, to break it. Blake chuckled darkly. "What do you say we give her a little scare? Remind her what happens when people step out of line?" He didn't need to elaborate further. They both knew what he meant, and they both knew they wouldn't face repercussions for whatever they planned to do. They had done it before, gotten away with it, and tonight was no different in their eyes. Aisha noticed the approaching headlights, the patrol car's lights casting a long shadow ahead of her as the car slowly rolled to a stop beside her. She felt a twinge of unease but quickly steadied herself, telling herself she had nothing to fear as long as she stayed calm and collected. This was far from the first time she had been stopped by the police, and she knew how to handle herself. She stopped walking and looked over as Harris and Blake stepped out of their vehicle, their movements slow and deliberate, almost predatory. Harris was the first to speak, his voice dripping with mock courtesy. "Out a little late tonight, aren't we, Miss Carter?" Aisha met his gaze, refusing to show any sign of intimidation. "Just heading home," she replied evenly. "Is there a problem, officers?" Blake let out a low chuckle, taking a step closer, invading her personal space. "The problem is that you seem to think you can walk around here like you own the place. You know, people in this neighborhood don't usually have your attitude." Aisha could feel their hostility radiating off them, palpable and dark. She remained steady, keeping her voice calm but firm. "I have every right to be here, just like anyone else," she said, trying to keep the conversation neutral, aware that any perceived challenge could set them off further. But Harris's expression twisted with irritation at her calm demeanor. He wasn't looking for a calm conversation, he wanted to provoke her, to break her spirit. "We've been hearing about some troublemakers around here," he sneered, "and you fit the description." Aisha felt a surge of anger but kept it buried, knowing she couldn't afford to let them see her reaction. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, her voice still calm. though she could feel her heart beating faster. "I'm just walking home. If there's nothing else, I'd like to keep going." Blake took another step closer, his tone dropping to a whisper laced with menace. "I don't think you understand, Miss Carter. You don't decide when this ends. We do." The tension was thick, oppressive. Aisha realized that they weren't going to let her leave so easily. Her mind raced, assessing her options. She knew she could try to call for help, but in this isolated part of town, there was no one around. And she had little doubt that these men would only become more aggressive if she attempted to escape or resist. She reached into her bag, under the guise of getting her phone, and quickly sent a single message to her father with her location, a silent plea for help before they could notice. Harris's eyes narrowed as he watched her. "You think you're clever, huh? Always acting like you're better than everyone else. People like you are the reason we have so much trouble around here." Aisha looked up, meeting his gaze, her expression a mixture of defiance and fear. "People like me," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper, "or people who stand up to abuse." That did it. Harris's face twisted with rage, and he reached out, grabbing her by the arm and yanking her forward with a roughness that sent a jolt of pain up her shoulder. "Watch your mouth," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "You don't get to talk to us like that." Blake, watching with a smirk, suggested, "Why don't we teach her some respect? Show her what happens when you think you're untouchable." They dragged her toward an old, rusted metal pole that stood abandoned in a neglected lot nearby. Aisha struggled, but they tightened their grip, forcing her to comply. Her heart pounded as they roughly twisted her arms behind her back, securing her wrists with tight, cutting restraints. She bit her lip to keep from crying out as the cold metal pressed into her skin, a searing pain that only added to the humiliation. Harris and Blake stepped back, admiring their work, smirking as she stood there, bound and vulnerable. "How does that feel?" Miss Carter Harris sneered, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "Think you're still in control?" Aisha tried to steady her breathing, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She straightened her posture as best she could, looking directly at them with a fierce resolve that only infuriated them further. "You can tie me up, but you'll never silence me," she said, her voice strong despite her circumstances. Blake laughed darkly, shaking his head. "Oh, we'll see about that. You're going to learn that people like us are in charge here. People like you are nothing but a nuisance." In the distance, Aisha thought she saw a shadow moving, a figure she almost didn't dare hope for. Her father, former Special Forces Sergeant Nathan Carter, had seen the message and had followed the directions without hesitation. As he approached, hidden in the shadows, he took in the scene, his face hardening with an anger that was both silent and deadly. His daughter, restrained and humiliated, faced these men with a bravery he recognized, a bravery he had instilled in her since she was a child. But now, that bravery needed to be protected, and Nathan Carter was more than prepared to handle the situation. He took a slow, steady breath, his hands tightening into fists as he prepared to show these men that they had made a fatal error in judgment. Nathan Carter approached the scene with the stealth and precision of a seasoned soldier. He had trained himself to move without a sound, to blend into the background, even when the world around him was on high alert. And tonight, his daughter's silent call for help had ignited a fury within him that he hadn't felt in years. As he watched from the shadows, he assessed the situation with a cold, calculating gaze, noting every movement, every smug expression on the officers' faces, and every wince of pain that crossed Aisha's own. Harris and Blake were enjoying themselves, that much was clear. They reveled in the power they thought they held, in the control they believed was absolute. To them, Aisha was just another lesson to be taught, a lesson in submission, a reminder of who truly ruled the streets. They leaned against the pole she was tied to, making snide remarks and exchanging glances that dripped with a twisted satisfaction. It was as if they had rehearsed this countless times, each word and gesture fine-tuned to instill fear and humiliation. "Look at you," Harris sneered, running a gloved hand down her arm, close enough to provoke but careful not to leave any evidence. Still holding that chin up, still acting all high and mighty. "You think you're better than us." Aisha gritted her teeth, refusing to let the tears prickling her eyes fall. She would not give them that. "I know I'm better than you," she replied, her voice steady, despite the slight tremble betraying her fear. "At least I don't abuse my power." Blake's laughter was harsh, grating. He shoved her shoulder, forcing her to stagger against the pole, her restraints digging painfully into her wrists. "Power," he mocked, his face close enough for her to see the contempt in his eyes. "You don't know the first thing about power. People like us, we make the rules. People like you just follow them or suffer the consequences." Nathan's jaw clenched as he watched his daughter's suffering. Every cruel word, every humiliating touch fueled his anger, building within him a desire to end this twisted game once and for all. He was ready, but he knew he had to be precise. He couldn't let them hurt her further, yet he had to make sure that his move was flawless. Years of training had taught him that timing was everything. Harris glanced at Blake, a smirk crossing his face. "Think we should leave her here for a while. Let her see how it feels to be powerless." Blake's grin widened. "Oh, absolutely. Maybe it'll finally knock some sense into her, teach her to stay in her place." They exchanged a nod, one that Nathan recognized all too well. It was the nod of men who had decided they could take things even further. Before he could move, he saw Harris reach into his jacket and pull out a small bottle of water. Without warning, he poured it over Aisha's head, the cold liquid soaking her hair and clothes, making her gasp as the chill seeped into her skin. "There you go," Harris said with a smirk. "Cool off a bit. Might help you think more clearly." Aisha shivered, biting back the humiliation and anger that threatened to spill over. She knew they were trying to break her, to strip her of her dignity. But she held firm, her mind clinging to the hope that her father had seen her message and was on his way. Her father had always been her rock, the one who taught her strength and resilience. She could almost feel his presence, as if he were nearby, watching over her. And he was. Nathan had seen enough. He stepped out of the shadows, his stance calm yet imposing, his eyes cold as they fixed on the two officers. For a moment he simply stood there, allowing the impact of his presence to sink in. Harris and Blake froze, their laughter fading as they registered the tall, muscular figure in front of them. Nathan's silence, his expression of unyielding determination, sent an unspoken message that made their bravado waver. "Who the hell are you?" Blake finally demanded, attempting to regain his composure. He took a step forward, trying to assert dominance, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Nathan's gaze didn't waver. His voice was low, almost a growl, laced with an authority that came from years of command. "Let her go. Now," Harris scoffed, but his eyes darted between Nathan and Aisha, as if trying to gauge the relationship. He took a step closer to Nathan, his smirk returning as he attempted to intimidate. "And why should we listen to you? You don't get to tell us what to do." Nathan's expression remained unchanged. "That's my daughter you have tied to that pole," he said, each word delivered with chilling precision. "And you have about 5 seconds to step away from her before I make you regret ever laying a hand on her." Blake exchanged a quick glance with Harris, trying to assess the situation. "Look, buddy," he said, attempting to sound casual but failing to mask the tension in his voice. "You need to back off. This is official police business. Your daughter here was causing trouble, and we're just doing our job." Nathan's eyes narrowed, his patience wearing thin. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between himself and the officers. His voice dropped to a lethal whisper. "Your job doesn't include abusing innocent people. Now, last warning, let her go." Harris, his ego stung, reached for his baton, his face twisting with anger. "You think you can just walk in here and tell us what to do?" he snarled. "People like you don't get to make the rules." But before Harris could react, Nathan moved with lightning speed, his hand shooting out and grabbing Harris's wrist in an iron grip. In one swift, practiced motion, he twisted Harris's arm, forcing him to drop the baton with a pained yelp. Blake, stunned, reached for his gun, but Nathan's other hand lashed out, striking Blake's wrist and sending the gun clattering to the ground. In a matter of seconds, Nathan had disarmed both officers, leaving them stunned and off balance. He released Harris with a final, forceful shove, sending him stumbling back against the patrol car. Blake scrambled to pick up his weapon, but Nathan's voice, calm and commanding, stopped him cold. "Pick that up. And you'll regret it," Nathan said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The officers hesitated, glancing at each other, their confidence shattered by the man standing before them. Harris sneered, trying to mask his fear with anger. "You're going to pay for this," he spat. "You think you can just assault officers and walk away?" Nathan's gaze turned icy. "Assault," he repeated, his voice deadly soft. "I haven't even started." He moved toward Aisha, his hands steady as he cut through her restraints. As he freed her, his eyes never left the two officers, watching for any sign of retaliation. Aisha felt a surge of relief wash over her as her father's hand steadied her, grounding her amidst the turmoil. But she could sense his simmering anger, his silent vow to make these men understand the consequences of their actions. Blake, struggling to regain control, sneered, "You think you're some kind of hero? You're just making this worse for both of you." Nathan turned to face him, his eyes dark and unyielding. "No, I think you're the ones who made it worse. You had every opportunity to walk away. But now you'll learn what it feels like to be powerless." The two officers, no longer certain of their own dominance, began to back away, the reality of their situation finally sinking in. Nathan's calm, his relentless focus, unnerved them in a way they hadn't anticipated. They had come expecting to humiliate a defenseless woman, but instead they were faced with a father willing to go to any lengths to protect his daughter. Without breaking eye contact, Nathan spoke, his voice carrying the weight of a lifetime of discipline and resolve. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, but you're about to find out." And as he advanced, Harris and Blake, the smirks and bravado stripped from their faces, realized they were facing a man who wasn't bound by their rules, a man who had nothing left to lose. As Nathan Carter stood between his daughter and the two officers, a chilling silence settled over the deserted industrial lot. The air was thick with the kind of tension that seemed ready to explode at any moment. Harris and Blake, who had moments earlier been so certain of their power and control, now found themselves facing a man who didn't flinch under their authority, a man who looked at them with a calm, calculated rage that spoke louder than any words. Nathan's face was unreadable, but his eyes were locked on Harris and Blake, his gaze cold and unrelenting. He was assessing every movement, every slight shift in their posture, waiting for the moment when he would need to act. This was a man trained to notice the smallest details, to respond with precision and without hesitation. He had spent years in situations where lives depended on his ability to read a room, to understand his opponents before they even understood themselves. And now all those years of training were coming to bear as he prepared to dismantle these two men piece by piece. Blake was the first to break the silence, his voice laced with anger and fear. "You're going to regret this," he spat, trying to mask his growing unease with bravado. "Assaulting police officers is a serious crime. You'll spend the rest of your life rotting in a cell for this." Nathan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step toward Blake, his gaze never leaving the officer's face. "You think you're in control here?" he asked, his voice low and measured, each word carefully chosen. "You think you can just walk up to my daughter, humiliate her, hurt her, and then act like you're the victim when someone finally stands up to you?" Blake shifted uneasily, his confidence wavering as Nathan's calm, menacing presence bore down on him. Harris, still nursing the pain in his wrist from where Nathan had twisted it, took a step back, his eyes darting between his partner and the man before them. He was beginning to understand that this was no ordinary father defending his child. This was a man who was capable of far more than they had anticipated. Nathan's voice remained steady as he continued, "You two have been playing this game for a long time, haven't you? Picking out people you think you can intimidate, people you think are too scared or too weak to fight back. But tonight, you picked the wrong family." Blake sneered, trying to reassert himself. "We're cops, we enforce the law. And you're nothing but a thug in the wrong place at the wrong time." Nathan's lips twisted into a faint, humorless smile. "A thug? You think I'm a thug?" He let out a low, humorless chuckle that sent a chill down both officers' spines. "If you had any idea who I am, you'd be begging for mercy right now." Harris, still unwilling to fully accept the shift in power, took a shaky step forward, trying to reassert control. "I don't care who you think you are," he said, attempting to keep his voice steady. "You're outnumbered, and if you so much as lay a finger on us again, we'll make sure you regret it." Nathan's expression hardened, his patience reaching its limit. He could see the desperation in their eyes, the realization that they were outmatched, even if they were too proud to admit it. He took another step forward, now only a foot away from Harris, his gaze locked onto the officers with a piercing intensity. "Go ahead," Nathan said quietly. "Make me regret it. I dare you." The challenge hung in the air, daring them to act, daring them to try and take back control. Blake and Harris exchanged a glance, their hands twitching toward their weapons, but they hesitated. Nathan's presence was overwhelming, suffocating, and they were beginning to realize that any move they made could be their last. In a sudden burst of frustration, Blake lunged forward, his hand reaching for his baton. But Nathan was faster. In a single, fluid motion, he caught Blake's wrist and twisted it behind his back, forcing him down onto his knees with a sharp, precise movement. Blake let out a pained grunt as his shoulder wrenched painfully, his face contorting in agony. Harris, panicking, tried to intervene, but Nathan released Blake just as quickly, turning his attention to the other officer with a cold, calculated fury. He moved with a grace and precision that spoke to years of training, years spent mastering the art of combat. Within seconds, he had both men subdued, forced to their knees, their weapons scattered on the ground. Breathing heavily, Blake and Harris looked up at him, their expressions a mixture of fear and defiance. They were beginning to understand that they had lost, but their pride wouldn't allow them to admit it. They glared at Nathan, their eyes filled with hatred, as if sheer force of will could somehow reverse the situation. Nathan crouched down in front of them, his face inches from theirs. His voice was soft, almost a whisper, but each word cut through the silence like a knife. "You two think you're untouchable, don't you? You think you can do whatever you want just because you have a badge. But let me tell you something, I've dealt with people a lot tougher and a lot scarier than you, and I've never backed down, not once." Harris's breathing was ragged, his chest heaving as he fought to maintain his composure. "This isn't over," he gasped, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "We'll make you pay for this. You and your daughter, you'll pay." Nathan's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing as he regarded the officer with a look of pure contempt. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice deadly calm. "I'm not afraid of you. I'm not afraid of your threats. And if you ever go near my daughter again, I'll make sure you never forget what happened here tonight." For a brief moment, a flicker of doubt crossed Harris's face. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat, choked by the weight of Nathan's gaze. He could see it now. This wasn't a man who would be intimidated, who would back down. This was a man who would go to any lengths to protect his family, a man who would stop at nothing to see justice served. Blake, still on his knees, spat at the ground, his voice laced with venom. "You're just a thug, just like everyone else in this neighborhood. No matter what you do, we'll always be in control. People like you don't matter." Nathan's eyes flashed with anger, and for a moment it seemed as if he might lose his composure. But he took a deep breath, steadying himself, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. Instead, he leaned in closer, his voice barely a whisper. "You think you're in control? You're not even close. Tonight, I'm the one in control. And you're going to remember that for the rest of your miserable lives." With a swift, decisive movement, Nathan stood, leaving the two officers on their knees, humiliated and defeated. He walked over to Aisha, who had been watching the entire scene with a mixture of relief and awe. She could see the controlled fury in her father's eyes, the fierce protectiveness that had driven him to stand up to these men without hesitation. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice gentle, as he reached out to untie her wrists. Aisha nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude and admiration. She could feel the sting of her bruised wrists, but the pain was a small price to pay for her freedom. As Nathan freed her, he cast one last, lingering glance at the two officers, a silent warning that needed no words. Harris and Blake, still on the ground, looked up at him with a mixture of fear and defiance, their pride refusing to allow them to show weakness even in defeat. But deep down they knew. They knew they had made a mistake they would never live down, a mistake that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. And as they watched Nathan and Aisha walk away, they understood that they had lost more than just a confrontation. They had lost their sense of power, their illusion of control, shattered by a man who refused to be intimidated. Nathan and Aisha walked in silence, the weight of the night's events settling over them like a heavy fog. For a brief moment, Nathan allowed himself to feel the anger and fear that had driven him to action, to acknowledge the depths of his love for his daughter and the lengths he was willing to go to protect her. As they reached the edge of the lot, Nathan placed a reassuring hand on Aisha's shoulder, his voice calm and steady. "They won't bother you again," he said quietly. "I promise you that." Aisha nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude and pride. She knew her father had risked everything for her, had faced down men who held power and authority without hesitation. And she knew that no matter what happened, she would always have him by her side, a guardian and a warrior, willing to fight for her no matter the cost. Nathan Carter stood tall, his gaze never leaving the two officers still on their knees, bound by the invisible chains of fear and humiliation. The night was heavy, the quiet stillness amplifying every breath, every shuffle, every heartbeat that echoed in the emptiness of the industrial lot. His daughter, Aisha, stood nearby, rubbing her bruised wrists, her eyes wide with a mixture of relief and the lingering shock of what she had endured. For Nathan, however, the night was far from over. He knew these men, Harris and Blake, the kind of men who wielded authority not as a duty, but as a weapon. He had seen them in every corner of the world, hiding behind uniforms, believing themselves untouchable. And Nathan had learned long ago that men like these only understood one language: fear. And tonight he intended to speak it fluently. Harris attempted to pull himself together, his face contorting with fury and frustration. "You think this ends here?" he spat, the words laced with a venomous desperation. "You think you can just walk away from this? You're going to regret this. Both of you." Nathan took a slow, measured step toward him, his face calm but his eyes blazing with a dark, controlled rage. "Regret," he repeated softly, his voice almost a whisper. "I think you're the ones who should be worried about regret." Blake, still nursing his bruised pride, glanced at his partner, his face twisted in hatred. "We're police officers," he sneered, his voice shaking slightly despite his efforts to sound defiant. "When they find out about this, they'll come after you. Your life, her life, it'll be over." Nathan's gaze didn't waver. "You really think anyone's going to come looking for you out here?" He gestured to the desolate surroundings, the empty warehouses and darkened alleys that stretched endlessly in every direction. "We're in the middle of nowhere. There's no one here but us." A flicker of doubt crossed Blake's face, and Nathan seized on it. He stepped even closer, his presence overwhelming, oppressive, as if he were a shadow looming over them, ready to swallow them whole. "You made a mistake tonight," he continued, his tone chillingly calm. "You thought you could scare my daughter, humiliate her, maybe even worse. But now you're starting to realize that you're the ones who should be afraid." Harris shifted uncomfortably, his bravado faltering as he met Nathan's unyielding gaze. "You can't just—" "Oh, but I can," Nathan interrupted, his voice cold and unrelenting. "And I will. Because people like you, who use your badge to terrorize others, you're nothing but cowards. You hide behind your authority, but strip that away, and what are you?" Neither officer responded. Their silence, once arrogant and filled with the certainty of their power, was now strained and tinged with fear. The realization that they had lost control of the situation was sinking in, but pride and anger kept them from fully accepting the gravity of their predicament. Nathan knelt down, his face mere inches from theirs, his eyes gleaming with an intensity that made both men flinch. "Let me explain something to you," he murmured. "You think you're tough because you carry a gun, because you have a badge. But out here, none of that matters. Out here, you're just two scared little boys who picked the wrong target." Blake clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists, his frustration bubbling over. "You don't scare us," he said, though his voice betrayed him with a slight tremor. "You're just another thug pretending to be a hero." Nathan's expression remained impassive, but his eyes flashed with something darker, something lethal. "You want to see a thug?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Fine, I'll show you what a real thug looks like." Before either man could react, Nathan reached out and grabbed Blake's collar, pulling him up roughly until they were eye to eye. Blake let out a startled gasp, his earlier bravado vanishing as he found himself face to face with a man who held no fear, no hesitation. Nathan's grip was ironclad, unbreakable, and Blake could feel the power radiating from him, an unspoken threat that cut through any remaining illusions of control. Harris made a move to intervene, but Nathan shot him a warning glance, his voice a deadly whisper. "Stay where you are," he said, each word a cold blade slicing through the night. "You don't want to test me right now." Harris froze, his body tense, his instincts screaming at him to run, to escape the predator that now held them captive. But fear rooted him to the spot, the weight of Nathan's presence pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. Nathan turned his attention back to Blake, his voice dropping to an even softer tone, one that somehow carried more menace than any shouted threat. "Let me make this clear," he said. If you ever go near my daughter again, if you so much as look at her, I'll make sure this night is the last thing you ever remember." Blake's face paled, his defiance crumbling under the weight of Nathan's words. He wanted to respond, to reclaim some scrap of dignity, but he couldn't summon the strength. All he could see was the unwavering conviction in Nathan's eyes, a promise of violence that felt as real and tangible as the ground beneath him. Satisfied, Nathan released his grip, letting Blake collapse back onto his knees, his breathing ragged, his pride shattered. He turned to Harris, his gaze hardening. "And you," he said, his tone unforgiving, "you think you're any different? You think hiding behind your partner makes you any less of a coward?" Harris swallowed, his throat dry, but managed to muster a weak glare. "You'll regret this," he muttered, though the words lacked the force they once held. "People like you don't get to talk to us like this." Nathan let out a low, humorless laugh. "People like me," he leaned closer, his voice dripping with contempt. "You don't even know who you're dealing with." He straightened, stepping back as he regarded the two men with a mixture of disdain and pity. They were broken, reduced to their raw, fearful selves, stripped of the facade of power they clung to so desperately. And for Nathan, that was enough. He had proven his point, left them with a lesson they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. But before he could turn to leave, he noticed a faint glimmer in Blake's eyes, a spark of hatred, a flicker of defiance that hadn't been extinguished. It was the look of a man who had lost, but who would return, who would seek vengeance given the first opportunity. Nathan's expression hardened, his decision made. He couldn't let them walk away with even a sliver of hope, a single thread of revenge to cling to. He needed to break them completely, to ensure that they would never again threaten his family or anyone else. In one swift motion, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folding knife, its blade gleaming in the dim light. He didn't intend to use it, but the sight alone was enough to send a fresh wave of terror through both men. They recoiled, their faces paling as they realized the depths of his resolve. "Do you understand now?" Nathan asked softly, his voice carrying a deadly calm. "This is what happens when you cross the wrong people. This is what happens when you let power go to your head." Blake and Harris said nothing, their eyes locked on the blade, their breaths coming in shallow gasps. They were trapped, helpless, bound by the iron grip of fear that Nathan had instilled in them. And in that moment they understood that he was not a man to be trifled with, that any further defiance would lead to consequences they weren't prepared to face. Nathan held the knife steady, letting the weight of the moment sink in, letting them feel the full extent of his control. He didn't need to use it, the threat alone was enough. He had achieved what he came to do, broken them without shedding a single drop of blood, without stooping to their level of cruelty. This was his justice, swift, unrelenting, and absolute. Finally, he lowered the knife, his gaze still fixed on them as he spoke one last time. "You'll remember this night, and if you ever think about coming after my family again, just know I'll be watching, and I won't be so merciful next time." With that, he turned and walked back to Aisha, his footsteps echoing in the silence as he left the two officers kneeling in the darkness, their spirits crushed, their illusions shattered. He placed a reassuring hand on his daughter's shoulder, his expression softening as he met her gaze. "It's over," he said quietly, his voice filled with a gentle strength that belied the storm that had raged within him. "They won't bother you again." Aisha nodded, her relief mingled with a deep, abiding respect for the man who had risked everything to protect her. Together, they turned and walked away, leaving behind the broken shells of two men who would forever carry the scars of that night, haunted by the memory of a father's wrath. And as they disappeared into the night, the industrial lot fell silent once more, the weight of what had transpired lingering in the air like a spectre, a warning that would never be forgotten. The night grew colder as Nathan and Aisha walked away from the two officers they had left humiliated and broken. But Nathan knew the type of men Harris and Blake were, men who wouldn't let this go. In their minds, power and control were the very foundation of their identities, and Nathan's actions had torn that foundation apart. Walking away was never going to be enough. He had to make them fully understand that coming after his daughter, or anyone else he cared about, would be their final mistake. He stopped suddenly, his hand tightening around Aisha's shoulder, his gaze fixed ahead. "Stay here," he said in a low, controlled voice. Aisha looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination. "Dad, what are you going to do?" Nathan's face was calm, but his eyes betrayed a deadly resolve. "I need to make sure they understand. Men like them don't learn from a single lesson. They'll go back to their old ways unless I give them something they'll never forget." Aisha wanted to protest, but she could see in her father's expression that he had already made up his mind. She nodded silently, stepping back as he turned and walked toward the officers, who were now beginning to pull themselves together, trying to salvage their shattered pride. Harris and Blake had managed to get to their feet, their faces twisted with humiliation and barely contained rage. They were bruised, shaken, and the realization that they had been completely overpowered by one man was written in every tense muscle, every clenched jaw. They tried to avoid each other's eyes, both aware that this defeat would haunt them for the rest of their careers, if they even managed to keep those careers. Seeing Nathan approach again, a flicker of defiance reignited in Blake's eyes. He straightened, wiping the blood from his lip, his gaze hardening. "What now?" he spat, struggling to keep the tremor out of his voice. He had enough fun yet. "P." Nathan stopped a few feet away, his posture calm, his hands relaxed at his sides, but his eyes sharp, assessing every move, every breath the officers took. He didn't answer immediately, letting the silence grow heavy, forcing them to confront the weight of his presence. "I'm not finished with you yet," Nathan finally said, his voice soft but laced with a deadly edge. "You thought you could walk away from this, that you'd go back to your lives, pretend this never happened. But that's not how this works. You need to understand fully that if you ever go after my daughter again, if you ever think about abusing your power like this, it'll be the last thing you ever do." Harris sneered, his voice thick with hatred. "You think you're the first punk to try to scare us? We've dealt with tougher than you, and we're still here." Nathan raised an eyebrow, his gaze cold and unyielding. "Is that so?" He took a step forward, his voice lowering to a whisper that sliced through the night. "Because from where I'm standing, you two don't look so tough right now." Blake tried to laugh, a harsh, grating sound that betrayed his fear. "You think we're just going to let this go? You think you're untouchable? We'll find you, your daughter will make your lives hell. You messed with the wrong people." Nathan's expression didn't change. "I've heard that before," he said calmly. "From men a lot scarier than you." He took another step forward, his gaze hardening. "But none of them are still around to tell the story." For a moment, Blake and Harris were silent, the reality of Nathan's words settling over them. They could feel the threat in his tone, the promise of consequences that went beyond anything they had experienced. But their pride, their need to reassert control, kept them from backing down. Blake took a step forward, his face twisted in fury. "You think you're a hero," he hissed. "You think you can do whatever you want just because you're mad. We're the law. We'll make sure you pay for this. You'll wish you had never laid a hand on us." Nathan's gaze darkened, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You're not the law. You're just men who got a little taste of power and let it corrupt you. Real power doesn't come from a badge or a gun. Real power is knowing when to use it and when to show mercy. And tonight you're lucky that I'm in a merciful mood." Harris, his face flushed with rage and humiliation, took a shaky step forward. "We'll see how merciful you are when we're done with you." Nathan's lips curved into a cold smile, one that held no warmth, no forgiveness. "I don't think you understand the situation you're in," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're out of your depth, and if you keep pushing, I'll show you just how far that depth goes." The silence stretched thick with tension as the two officers struggled to comprehend the full extent of Nathan's threat. But Nathan wasn't finished. He needed them to feel the weight of his resolve, to understand that this was not a game, that there were no second chances. In one swift, unexpected motion, he reached out, grabbing Blake by the collar and pulling him close. Blake's eyes widened, his bravado crumbling as he felt the iron grip of a man who had faced far worse enemies. Nathan's voice was a low, deadly whisper, meant only for Blake's ears. "If you so much as breathe in my daughter's direction again, I will find you," he said, his words carrying the weight of a promise. "I will find you, and I will make sure you pay for every single thing you've ever done. Do you understand me?" Blake's face was pale, his breathing shallow as he met Nathan's gaze. He tried to nod, the words caught in his throat, but Nathan didn't release him, holding him there, forcing him to confront the reality of his situation. "Do you understand me?" Nathan repeated, his tone unyielding. Blake finally managed to shaky nod, his voice barely a whisper. Yes, I understand." Satisfied, Nathan released him, letting him stumble back, his hands shaking as he struggled to compose himself. He turned to Harris, who was watching the scene with a mixture of fear and defiance, his pride warring with the instinct to flee. "And you?" Nathan asked, his gaze piercing. "Do you understand what's at stake here?" Harris glared at him, his jaw clenched, but there was a flicker of fear in his eyes, a recognition of the force he was up against. He nodded, a reluctant acknowledgement of his own powerlessness. Nathan took a step back, his gaze still fixed on them, making sure they understood that this was not a threat, but a promise. "Good," he said quietly. "Because if I ever hear about you hurting someone else, if I ever see you using your badge to abuse your power again, I'll be back. And I won't be so forgiving." The two officers stood frozen, their faces pale, their bravado shattered. They knew, in that moment, that they had lost, that they would carry the scars of this night for the rest of their lives. And as Nathan turned and walked back to his daughter, leaving them in the silence of the empty lot, they understood that they had crossed a line they could never uncross. Nathan and Aisha walked in silence, the weight of the night's events settling over them like a shroud. Aisha could feel the tension in her father's posture, the lingering anger that had driven him to action. She knew that he had done what he believed was necessary, that he had stood up for her in a way that no one else ever had. But as they reached the edge of the lot, Nathan paused, his gaze distant, his mind still consumed by the events of the night. He turned to Aisha, his expression softening as he placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's over," he said quietly, his voice filled with a gentle strength that belied the storm that had raged within him. "They won't bother you again." Aisha nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude and pride. She knew her father had risked everything for her, had faced down men who held power and authority without hesitation. And she knew that no matter what happened, she would always have him by her side, a guardian and a warrior, willing to fight for her no matter the cost. As they disappeared into the night, the silence of the empty lot remained, a testament to the events that had transpired, a warning to anyone who dared cross the line Nathan had drawn. The next day dawned with an uneasy calm, but the events of the previous night still lingered in the minds of those who had been there. For Nathan Carter, a quiet man who had always kept to himself, Last night's confrontation was unlike anything he had faced in years. As he sat at his kitchen table, sipping coffee in silence, he replayed every moment in his mind: Harris's sneer, Blake's threats, and the fierce protectiveness that had surged through him when he saw his daughter in danger. He had never anticipated becoming that person again, the man who met violence with unflinching resolve, but they had left him no choice. Aisha walked into the kitchen, her face still bruised and wrists sore, but her spirit unbroken. She placed a gentle hand on her father's shoulder, sensing the conflict within him. "Dad, are you okay?" she asked softly, her eyes filled with concern. Nathan nodded, offering her a small, reassuring smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart." Just, thinking he looked at her, a wave of guilt washing over him. "I'm sorry you had to go through that. If I could have." "Dad," Aisha interrupted, her voice firm but kind. "You were there for me. You protected me when no one else would. You didn't just stand up to them, you stood up for all the people they've hurt. I'll always be grateful for that." He placed his hand over hers, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I just wish it didn't have to come to this," he murmured. "But some people, they don't understand anything but force. And I had to make sure they wouldn't hurt you or anyone else again." Their quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up outside. Nathan tensed instinctively, his mind flashing back to Harris and Blake, wondering if they had come back for more. He stood, moving to the window to peer outside. What he saw wasn't police lights, but the plain black sedan of a government car. The door opened, and a man in a suit stepped out, his face unreadable, his eyes hidden behind dark glasses. Nathan's stomach tightened. He knew who this was, or at least what he represented. He had worked with men like him in his past life, men who were sent when the authorities wanted to send a message without making it public. Nathan had known this day might come, but he had hoped it wouldn't come so soon. He turned to Aisha, his expression serious. "Stay here," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Let me handle this." Aisha opened her mouth to protest, but the look in his eyes silenced her. She nodded reluctantly, watching as her father stepped outside to meet the man. Nathan closed the door behind him, taking a deep breath before approaching the stranger. The man in the suit regarded him with a measured look, his expression neutral but with a hint of disdain. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice cool and professional. "You've made quite an impression recently." Nathan didn't respond, merely crossing his arms and waiting. He wasn't going to let this man control the conversation, and he certainly wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of a nervous reply. The man smiled faintly, as if amused by Nathan's silence. "Last night, 2 officers, Officer Harris and Officer Blake, reported an altercation. They claim you attacked them and made several, well, let's just call them threats." Nathan's face remained impassive. If they're looking for sympathy, they came to the wrong place. The man raised an eyebrow, clearly unaccustomed to being spoken to so bluntly. "I see," he replied slowly. "But the department doesn't take these matters lightly, Mr. Carter. Harris and Blake are looking to press charges, serious charges. Assaulting officers, making threats. These are not things that the department can simply overlook." Nathan met his gaze unflinchingly. "Those 2 men tied my daughter to a pole and left her there, humiliated and terrified. They abused their power, and they've done it to others. I didn't assault them, I defended my family." The man sighed, as if exasperated by Nathan's resistance. "Look, Mr. Carter, I'm not here to debate morality. I'm here to resolve this before it becomes messy. There are ways to handle this quietly. If you apologize, agree to stay out of their way, maybe the charges can be minimized." Nathan felt a surge of anger, a slow burning fury that made his blood run cold. "Apologize," he repeated, his voice deadly soft. You want me to apologize for protecting my daughter from two men who think their badges make them untouchable." The man's expression hardened. "I suggest you think carefully about your next move, Mr. Carter. You're not in the military anymore. You don't have the resources or the protection you used to. You're just one man, and if you keep pushing, you'll be left with nothing." Nathan took a step closer, his voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. "I may be just one man, but I'm the man who stood up to them. And if you think I'm going to back down because you walked up to my door with some empty threats, you don't know who you're dealing with." For a brief moment, the man seemed taken aback, as if he hadn't anticipated such defiance. But he quickly recovered, his smile returning, colder than before. "Very well, Mr. Carter," he said smoothly. "I can see that you're set in your ways. Just remember, men like you don't last long when they go up against the system. It has a way of removing obstacles." Nathan held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "Tell your friends that if they come after me, they better be ready for a fight. I'm not going to let anyone hurt my family. Not now, not ever." The man regarded him for a moment, his face unreadable. Finally, he inclined his head slightly, as if in acknowledgement. "You've made your choice," he said quietly. "I hope, for your sake, it was the right one." With that, he turned and walked back to his car, his movements smooth and controlled, like a man who knew he held the upper hand. He climbed into the driver's seat and pulled away, leaving Nathan standing alone in the driveway, the weight of the encounter settling heavily on his shoulders. Nathan stayed outside for a few moments, letting the cool morning air steady him. He knew the man's words weren't idle threats. There would be consequences for what he had done, for standing up to men like Harris and Blake. But he also knew that he had no choice. He had made a promise to protect his daughter, and he would keep that promise no matter the cost. When he finally returned to the house, Aisha was waiting for him, her face filled with worry. "Dad, who was that?" Nathan forced a reassuring smile, though he could feel the weight of the encounter pressing down on him. "Just someone from the department," he said, keeping his tone light. "Trying to scare me off." Aisha looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of fear. Are they going to come after you?" Nathan hesitated, then placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Let them try," he said quietly. "I'm not afraid of them. And as long as I'm here, they won't lay a hand on you. That's a promise." Aisha nodded, her worry easing slightly, though she could still see the tension in her father's eyes. She knew that he was protecting her, that he was doing everything he could to keep her safe. But she also knew that this wasn't over, that there would be a price to pay for standing up to men like Harris and Blake. And as father and daughter stood together in the quiet of their home, both of them understood that the battle they had fought was only the beginning, that there would be more to come. But they also knew that they would face it together, united in their determination to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. A few weeks passed, but the tension from that fateful night lingered, casting a shadow over Nathan and Aisha's lives. For days, Nathan remained on high alert, his instincts honed from years of military service, keeping him watchful of every unusual car on their street, every stranger's gaze that lingered a bit too long. He knew Harris and Blake wouldn't simply forget what happened, and the veiled threat from the man in the suit haunted him in quiet moments. But Nathan wasn't a man easily intimidated, and he would defend his daughter's safety as long as he drew breath. One morning, Aisha came into the kitchen, her face pensive. She placed a thick envelope on the table in front of Nathan. "It came today," she said quietly. Nathan looked at her, then down at the envelope, recognizing the seal of a law firm. Inside was an official statement from the police department, a report detailing Harris and Blake's suspension pending an investigation into the events of that night. Nathan opened it cautiously, reading every line. The department was conducting an internal review due to a series of complaints that had surfaced following his confrontation with the officers. Harris and Blake, it turned out, had histories of misconduct that had been swept under the rug for years. But Nathan's actions, his refusal to back down, had started a ripple effect that was now impossible to ignore. Aisha watched him read, her expression a mixture of relief and curiosity. Does this mean it's over? Nathan took a deep breath, a small sense of satisfaction settling in. For now, maybe, he said, his voice steady. But these men, they're not the type to change overnight. It takes more than just one investigation to get rid of a problem like this. Aisha nodded thoughtfully, sitting down across from him. But it's a start, right? Maybe this is what the community needed to know, that people like them don't get to just walk all over us. That they're not untouchable. Nathan looked at his daughter, pride swelling in his chest. He could see the strength and resilience in her eyes, the same strength that had driven him to protect her that night. You're right, Aisha, it's a start. But it's up to us to make sure it continues. Over the following months, Nathan and Aisha became active voices in their community, attending town hall meetings, speaking with local leaders, and advocating for accountability within the police department. Their story spread, igniting a spark among others who had also experienced mistreatment. People who had once felt powerless began to share their own stories, and soon the demand for justice grew louder. One evening, at a crowded town hall meeting, Aisha took the stage. Her face bore the scars of her ordeal, but her voice was unwavering. She spoke of the abuse she had endured, of the trauma that had almost broken her, but also of the strength she had found in standing up against it. The crowd listened in rapt silence, moved by her courage and determination. Change doesn't happen overnight, she said, her voice carrying through the room. But if we don't speak up, if we don't stand together, then nothing will ever change. We owe it to ourselves, to each other, and to the generations that come after us to make this place safe, to make sure that those who hold power are held accountable. Nathan stood at the back of the room, watching his daughter with a sense of pride and awe. He had spent years fighting battles he believed were necessary, but none had meant as much to him as this one. Aisha was standing up not just for herself, but for a community that had too often been silenced, and he knew that his role, his fight, was to support her every step of the way. As the months went by, the investigation into Harris and Blake intensified. The pressure from the community and the mounting evidence of their misconduct forced the department to take action. Eventually, both officers were removed from duty, a symbolic victory that marked a turning point in the community's fight for justice. But for Nathan and Aisha, the journey didn't end there. They continued to advocate for those who had been wronged, working tirelessly to bring about real, lasting change. The fear they had once felt had transformed into a relentless drive, a commitment to ensure that no one else would have to endure what they had. Together, they became pillars of resilience, symbols of a community's strength and determination to reclaim its dignity and safety. On a quiet evening sometime later, Nathan and Aisha sat on their porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was calm, a soft breeze rustling through the trees, and for the first time in a long while they felt at peace. Aisha looked over at her father, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I don't know if I could have done this without you, Dad," she said softly. "Thank you. For everything." Nathan smiled, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "You don't ever have to thank me, Aisha. Protecting you, that's all I've ever wanted. And now, seeing you stand up and lead, knowing you're making a difference, that's all the thanks I'll ever need." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the last light faded, leaving a sky full of stars. They knew that the road ahead would be long, that their fight was far from over. But they also knew that they had each other, and that together they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. And in the quiet strength of that moment, they understood that true power didn't come from a badge or a title. True power came from resilience, from the courage to stand up and fight for what was right, no matter the cost. And with that knowledge, they were ready to face the future, no longer afraid, but stronger than ever before.